single line of code just sold for more than your house, and the people buying it aren't trying to protect you. They're weaponizing it. In 1859, Edwin Drake drilled the first commercial oil well in Pennsylvania and changed the world forever. But this time, it's not oil. It's vulnerabilities. Security flaws in the software that runs our lives. And just like oil, there's a massive industry forming around finding it, extracting it, refining it, and selling it to the highest bidder. Except, unlike oil, most people have no idea this industry even exists. There are companies making billions by discovering weaknesses in your phone, your computer, your car, your medical devices. There are governments stockpiling these vulnerabilities like nuclear weapons. There are underground markets where a single exploit can sell for millions. And all of this is happening in the shadows, while the rest of us just try to browse the internet without getting hacked. By the end of this video, you're going to understand why cybersecurity has become the most lucrative and dangerous resource economy of the 21st century. Let me start with a story that sounds like fiction, but is absolutely real. In 2016, a group calling themselves the Shadow Brokers announced they had stolen hacking tools from the internet. Not just any hacking tools. The crown jewels, exploits that could break into almost any Windows computer in the world. They tried to auction these tools off to the highest bidder. Within months, those tools were used to create WannaCry, a ransomware attack that hit over 200,000 computers in 150 countries. Hospitals in the UK had to turn away patients. Factories shut down. Rail systems stopped working. The damage was estimated at $4 billion. And it all came from vulnerabilities that the NSA had discovered, kept secret, and weaponized instead of reporting them to Microsoft so they could be fixed. At the bottom level, you have bug bounty hunters. Companies like Google, Apple, Microsoft, they all run these programs. Find a serious vulnerability and report it responsibly. They'll pay you a reward. Google's top rewards go up to $30,000. Apple has paid out to $1.5 million for a single bug. Microsoft regularly pays 6 figures for critical vulnerabilities. There are bug bounty hunters making several $100,000 a year finding and reporting vulnerabilities. But here's the thing. Those public bug bounty rewards are nothing compared to what you can get on the private market. There are companies that will pay 5 times, 10 times, sometimes 20 times more than the official bounty. They're buying them to use them or to sell them to someone else who will use them. These companies are called exploit brokers, and they operate in a legal gray area. The most famous is probably Zero. They openly advertise the prices they pay for different types of vulnerabilities. An iOS zero-day exploit, meaning a vulnerability that Apple doesn't know about yet, can fetch up to $2 million. An Android exploit, up to $2.5 million. A Windows exploit with persistence, meaning it lets you maintain access even after the computer restarts, up to $2 million. These aren't theoretical numbers. These are prices they actually pay. And Zerodium isn't alone. There's CrowdFence, Exodus Intelligence, Viewpen, now called Zerodium Europe. Who are they selling to? That's where it gets interesting. They claim they only sell to government agencies and law enforcement. for legitimate purposes, like fighting terrorism and catching criminals. And some of that is probably true. When the FBI wanted to unlock the iPhone of the San Bernardino shooter, they ended up paying over $1 million to a contractor who had a zero-day exploit. The FBI couldn't crack the phone themselves. Apple refused to help, so they had to go to the private market and buy an exploit. But here's the problem. Once an exploit exists and is being sold, you can't really control where it ends up. Government A might buy it for legitimate law enforcement, but Government B might buy it for spying on dissidents and journalists. Criminal organizations might acquire it through theft or corrupt officials. Suddenly, the same exploit that was supposed to catch terrorists is being used to hack activists in Belarus, or journalists in Mexico, or opposition politicians in Saudi Arabia. Pegasus is probably the most sophisticated mobile phone hacking tool ever created. It can break into iPhones and Android devices, even fully updated ones. It can read your messages, listen to your calls, track your location, turn on your camera and microphone without you knowing. It's like science fiction, except it's real. NSO Group claims they only sell to government agencies for fighting terrorism and serious crime. They have strict export controls and vetting processes, but investigations by journalists and researchers have found Pegasus being used against human rights activists, journalists, lawyers, diplomats, and political opposition figures in dozens of countries. It was found on the phone of murdered Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi's family members. When confronted with this evidence, NSO Group says they can't control how their customers use the tool. Except that's not really true, because these companies know exactly what their products are being used for. They provide updates and support. They know when an exploit stops working because the target updated their software. The founder became a billionaire, all from selling hacking tools. These companies have created an entire industry around offensive cyber capabilities. It's become so big that it has its own trade shows. Now let's talk about the supply chain, because just like oil, cybersecurity has upstream and downstream markets. Upstream is the discovery and extraction. That's the bug bounty hunters and researchers finding vulnerabilities. And just like oil, there are massive profits at every stage. But here's where the oil analogy really becomes perfect. They can take months or years to develop, and they can be rendered useless by a single software update. That's why these companies guard them so carefully, and why they charge so much for them. There's also a geopolitical dimension to all of this. Countries are realizing that cyber capabilities are as important as conventional military capabilities, maybe more important. You can do a lot more damage with a good cyber weapon than you can with a missile, and it's much harder to trace back to you. So nations are investing heavily in offensive cyber programs. The US has Cyber Command. Russia has APT groups. China has the Ministry of State Security cyber divisions. Israel has Unit 8200. Every major power has teams of hackers working to develop cyber weapons, and they're all competing for the same finite resource. Vulnerabilities. This has created something like an arms race. Countries are stockpiling zero-day exploits, the way they used to stockpile nuclear weapons. The US government is estimated to know about thousands of unpatched vulnerabilities. They keep most of them secret so they can use them for intelligence and military operations. Other countries are doing the same thing, and just like with nuclear weapons, this creates a dangerous situation, because these weapons can be stolen. The shadow brokers, theft from the NSA, prove that. And unlike nuclear weapons, cyber weapons can be copied and shared infinitely. Once code is stolen, it's out there forever. There's a policy debate about this that's been going on for years. It's called the vulnerabilities equities process. When a government agency discovers a vulnerability, they're supposed to weigh whether to keep it secret for intelligence purposes or disclose it so it can be fixed. The problem is that the process is secret and there's no real accountability. We don't know how many vulnerabilities the government knows about. We don't know what criteria they use to decide what to keep secret. Critics argued that the government should disclose most vulnerabilities because keeping them secret makes everyone less secure. If the US government knows about a flaw in Windows, but doesn't tell Microsoft, that flaw can be exploited by China, Russia, criminals, terrorists. We're all less safe so that intelligence agencies can have their tools. The counter-argument is that these capabilities are necessary for national security. We need to be able to spy on adversaries. We need to be able to disrupt terrorist networks. We need to be able to conduct cyber operations against enemy infrastructure. And if we disclose every vulnerability we find, we lose that capability. It's a tough balance, and there's no easy answer. But what's clear is that the current system, where governments hoard vulnerabilities and private companies sell them to the highest bidder, creates serious risks. Let me give you a sense of scale here. The global cybersecurity market is worth over $200 billion, and it's growing at about 12% per year. But that's just the defensive side. The offensive side, the exploit market, the surveillance tools, the cyber weapons. That's harder to measure because so much of it is secret. But estimates put it at $10 to $20 billion and growing even faster. Or look at the private equity investments in offensive security companies. Thoma Bravo, one of the biggest private equity firms, has invested billions in cybersecurity. A company that develops exploits for penetration testing can also sell those same exploits to other buyers. How little regulation there is. In most countries, there are strict controls on weapons exports. You can't just sell missiles or fighter jets to whoever wants to buy them. There are international treaties, export licenses, oversight. But for cyber weapons, the rules are much looser. Some countries have started treating surveillance technology like weapons for export control purposes. The Wassenaar Arrangement added certain cybersecurity tools to its list of controlled items, but enforcement is inconsistent, and there are huge loopholes. Companies can set up subsidiaries in different countries to avoid export controls. They can claim their products are for defensive purposes, even when they're clearly offensive. They can sell through intermediaries to hide the end customer. The result is a Wild West market where almost anything goes. And just like the early days of the oil industry, where robber barons made fortunes with little regard for laws or ethics, we're seeing the same thing in cybersecurity. Fortunes being made, rules being broken, and consequences being ignored, until there's a disaster, and then everyone acts shocked. On the nation-state level, the US is probably still the leader in offensive cyber capabilities. The NSA's Tailored Access Operations Group is legendary. They've developed exploits for pretty much every major operating system and device. The US also has private contractors like Booz, Allen Hamilton, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, all developing cyber weapons for the government. The budget for this stuff is classified, but it's estimated to be in the billions. Israel is probably number 2. For a small country, they have an outsized presence in offensive cyber. It's where many Israeli hackers get their training, and when they leave the military, they often start companies. That's where NSO Group came from. And Verint and Checkpoint, and dozens of others. Israel has basically created a cyber weapons export industry. It's a major part of their economy. Russia is a different model. They have state actors, the GRU and FSB running cyber operations. They provide them with protection from prosecution in exchange for cooperation. Even when everyone knows that's not really true. China has invested massively in cyber capabilities over the past 20 years. They have multiple units under the PLA and Ministry of State Security dedicated to cyber operations. They focus heavily on espionage, stealing intellectual property, compromising supply chains. They're playing the long game, building capabilities that can be used in a conflict, but also gathering intelligence in peacetime. And they're developing their own domestic cybersecurity industry, so they're not dependent on Western technology. Then you have second-tier players. Iran has become surprisingly sophisticated. They've conducted operations against US banks, Saudi oil companies, and others. North Korea has pulled off some of the biggest cyber crimes in history. The Sony Pictures hack, the WannaCry ransomware, the theft of hundreds of millions of dollars from cryptocurrency exchanges. For a country that's cut off from the global economy, cyber operations are a way to generate revenue and project power. And it's not just nations. Large corporations are getting into offensive cyber as well. Not directly, but they hire the same contractors. They buy the same tools. For competitive intelligence, for protecting their own networks by understanding how attackers operate, for going after competitors. There have been cases of corporate espionage conducted through hacking, companies stealing trade secrets from competitors. It's rare because it's risky, but it happens. And as the tools become more available and the talent pool grows, it's probably going to happen more. Now, let's talk about the economics in more detail, because this is where it really becomes like oil. There's a concept in the oil industry called peak oil. The idea that oil production will eventually reach a maximum and then decline as reserves are depleted. Some people argue we're approaching peak vulnerabilities. That software is becoming secure enough that finding exploitable bugs will get harder and harder until eventually it's not economically viable anymore. But that assumes that defense outpaces offense. And historically, that hasn't been true. Attackers have almost always had the advantage because they only need to find one way in while defenders have to protect everything. But there are some reasons to think things might change. Software development practices are improving. More companies are doing security reviews. More developers are being trained in secure coding. Programming languages are evolving to make certain types of bugs impossible. Rust, for example, eliminates entire categories of memory corruption vulnerabilities. Operating systems are adding more security features. There's more investment in defense. The question is whether all of that will be enough to shift the balance. My guess is probably not, because as defenses improve, attackers just shift focus. 20 years ago, most exploits targeted buffer overflows and memory corruption bugs. Those are harder now, so attackers move to logic flaws and design weaknesses. They target the supply chain. They exploit human psychology through social engineering. They compromise third-party software and hardware. There's always a weakest link, and finding it is worth enough money that people will keep looking. That's why I think the cybersecurity economy will keep growing. The demand is almost infinite. Every government wants offensive capabilities. Every company needs to protect itself and understand threats. Every criminal wants tools to make money, and the supply, while limited, is constantly being replenished as new software is created. Every new app, every new device, every new system is potentially vulnerable. The attack surface keeps expanding. We're adding billions of IoT devices to the internet. Smart homes, smart cars, smart cities. Each one is a potential target. Each one needs to be secured, and each one creates opportunities for attackers. This is why cybersecurity companies are valued so highly. CrowdStrike, which went public in 2019, is worth over $40 billion. Cloudflare is worth over $20 billion. Palo Alto Networks is worth over $70 billion. These companies are growing rapidly because demand is growing, and the companies that figured out how to defend against the most sophisticated attacks are going to be worth even more. But here's the dark side of all this growth. The more valuable cybersecurity becomes, the more incentive there is to keep things insecure. If you're making money from vulnerabilities, you don't really want them all to be fixed. If you're selling defensive tools, you need threats to defend against. There's a perverse incentive structure where security remaining imperfect benefits the industry. This is like the medical industry making more money from treating diseases than from preventing them, or defense contractors profiting from ongoing conflicts. The optimal outcome for the businesses involved is not perfect security. It's managed insecurity. Enough threats to justify the spending, but not so many that the system collapses. I'm not saying companies are actively trying to keep things insecure, but the incentives are concerning. And we've seen cases where security researchers were pressured not to disclose vulnerabilities because it would hurt business relationships, or where patches were delayed because fixing the vulnerability would break something that customers depended on, or where known vulnerabilities were kept secret because they were useful for certain purposes. The profit motive doesn't always align with security. There's also a brain drain problem. The best security talent is being siphoned off by the highest bidders, and often, that's not the companies trying to secure their products. It's the exploit brokers, the offensive security firms, the government agencies. Why work at Microsoft fixing bugs for $150,000 a year when you could work at an exploit broker, finding bugs for $300,000? Why work in defense when offense pays better and is more exciting? This creates a vicious cycle where the companies building the products, we all use key OEM, attract the talent they need to make those products secure. Meanwhile, The people attacking those products have the best hackers money can buy. Let me tell you about one more dimension of this that's really concerning. But that's changing. The tools are leaking. They're being sold to less sophisticated actors. They're being shared in underground forums. We're seeing exploit kits that automate attacks so anyone can use them. We're seeing AI tools that can find vulnerabilities and write exploits faster than humans. This means the barrier to entry is dropping. A teenager with no formal training can download tools and launch attacks that would have required a team of experts a decade ago. Some people call this the script kiddie problem, but it's more serious than that. Because while most script kiddies are just causing mischief, some of them are causing real damage, and as the tools get more powerful and more available, the potential for damage increases. This is similar to what happened with other technologies. Nuclear weapons were initially only available to the US, then the Soviet Union, then a handful of other nations. There was concern about proliferation, about what would happen if the technology spread to less stable countries or non-state actors. Now, 9 countries have nuclear weapons, and there's constant concern about others acquiring them or about materials falling into the wrong hands. Cyber weapons are proliferating even faster because they're not physical. You can't intercept them at a border. You can't detect them with sensors. They're just code, and code can be copied and shared instantly. Once an exploit is out there, it's out there forever. This is why some people argue that governments shouldn't be stockpiling cyber weapons at all, because the risk of proliferation is too high. Some people are calling for international treaties around cyber weapons, similar to treaties on chemical or biological weapons, rules about what's acceptable, verification mechanisms, consequences for violations. The UN has been discussing this for years, but progress is slow because countries agree on what counts as a cyber weapon or what the rules should be. There should be oversight, maybe an international licensing system for exploit brokers and surveillance companies. This is starting to happen in some places. The EU has added spyware to its DLUCI export control list. There's also a push for more corporate responsibility, the idea that companies should be liable if their products are used to violate human rights. If you sell a hacking tool to a government and that government uses it to target journalists, you should face consequences. Some companies have been sued over this. NSO Group is currently facing multiple lawsuits. Apple sued them, Meta sued them. Individual victims have sued them. We'll see how those cases play out. But they could set precedents that change the industry. In the meantime, the boom continues. Investors are pouring money into cybersecurity startups. And most people have no idea it's even happening. They just know that their devices sometimes get hacked or their data gets stolen. They don't see the massive industry behind it, the billions of dollars. The geopolitical competition, the ethical compromises. But here's what you need to understand. This isn't going away. Cybersecurity is only going to become more important as more of our lives move online. Who controls the vulnerabilities controls the digital world, and who controls the digital world controls everything else. The companies and countries that are investing in offensive cyber capabilities now are positioning themselves for long-term dominance. Surveillance states using cyber tools to suppress dissent, corporations using them to steal from competitors, criminals using them to extort victims, and all of it is enabled by an industry that operates in the shadows and answers to no one. So, where does this leave us? We're living in a world where security vulnerabilities have become a commodity.